The Spanish sun, a merciless brass disk in a bleached white sky, beat down upon the rooftops of Madrid. But within the cavernous, stone-walled halls of the Royal, the summer heat of 1680 took on a different character. It was a stifling, stagnant warmth, heavy with the cloying scent of beeswax polish, dried lavender, and rosewater, a desperate, fragrant veil thrown over a far less pleasant truth, a truth that announced itself before its bearer even turned the corner. A faint, then unmistakable odor of corruption, of Swedish decay, like river weeds left to rot in the sun, undercut by a sharper, more acrid temps. Courtiers, faces schooled into masks of impeccable deference, would subtly half-step behind a column or feign a sudden interest in a tapestry as she passed. Their whispers were the rustle of silk on stone. La Princesa approaches. A flurry of hands would reach for silver pomanders and lace handkerchiefs doused in perfume. It was a futile ballet of politeness. The scent clung to the still air, a ghost of humiliation trailing the figure of Princess Margarita Teresa. At 19, she was a portrait by come to life, but one painted with a cruel brush. She possessed the fair Habsburg beauty, the pale, almost translucent skin, the cascade of golden hair. But it was framed by the unforgiving geometry of her lineage, the distinct jutting jaw, the full heavy lip. And now, this affliction. No amount of scrubbing with scented soaps, no poultice of crushed herbs from the royal botanist, no incense smoked into the very fibers of her gown could defeat it. It was a miasma from within, a cruel symptom of the very blood that made her royal. From the shadows of a colonnade, an old man watched her pass. Don Diego de Silva Y had been dead for 2 decades. But his ghost lingered in every brushstroke that adorned these walls. His eyes in memory saw what the courtiers refused to acknowledge. Not a single flawed girl, but the slow, inevitable unspooling of a dynasty. He had painted her as a radiant infant, a symbol of hope. Now he would have been forced to paint her as a tragic allegory, inheritance perhaps, or the price of purity. The real custodians of this grim truth were the physicians. In a cramped chamber smelling of dried herbs and chemical desperation, Dr. Luis de Mercathason, of the great Philip II's doctor, read his own father's treatise, De los Morbos Hereditaris. The words written a lifetime ago seemed to burn on the page. The repeated union of blood too close in kin produces fragile offspring, prone to illness and disfigurement, and in the worst cases, incapable of reproduction. The lineage becomes like a field sown with the same seed, season after season. The yield grows ever poorer, the stock ever weaker. He had presented this very volume to a young Philip IV. It had been politely received and utterly ignored. Politics, as always, trumped biology. The Habsburgs, who ruled an empire upon which the sun never set, believed their blood was a celestial fluid, a divine ichor that must be kept pure from the muddy streams of lesser nobility. They did not see that they were not purifying it, but distilling it into a poison. Down in the steam-shrouded kitchens, the old cook muttered incantations under her breath as she stirred a thick, green paste of rosemary, thyme, and other more secret herbs. Pobrecita, poor little rich girl, she sighed to the scullery boy. It is not her sin, but the sin of her grandfathers and uncles, that she wears like a perfume. She knew, as all the servants knew, the tangled web of the royal family tree, with so few branches, it was less a tree and more a single, gnarled, and failing trunk. The door burst open. The high steward, his face pale, hissed into the steam. "Faster, woman." The French ambassador is announced.
Ass!
She must be anointed before the audience. Ambassador Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Marquis de Torquay, was more than a diplomat. He was a master anatomist of power. Sharp as a scalpel, dissected every weakness, every flaw. His reports to Louis XIV, the Sun King, were not mere dispatches. They were clinical diagnoses of a rival's decline, a king's faltering step, a princess's unfortunate odor, a prince's inability to form a coherent sentence. These were not mere gossip. They were geopolitical data. They told him that the mighty Spanish oak was rotten at its core, and a strong wind from France would soon enough bring it crashing down. In her chambers, Margarita Teresa stood motionless, a doll being prepared for display. Her ladies-in-waiting, their smiles tight, worked with a frantic diligence. They layered her in the finest silks from Valencia, draped her in pearls from the New World, painted her face with a lead-based ceros that made her skin gleam like a porcelain saint's. They drenched her pulse points in civet and ambergris. A battle of aromas fought upon the battlefield of her skin. Tears welled in her eyes but did not fall. She had been taught since infancy that a Habsburg does not weep in public. Her reflection in the great silver mirror was a cruel parody of the Infanta he had once painted beautiful, yet disfigured. Opulent, yet tainted. It was a living, breathing, vanitous painting, a reminder of the decay that lurks beneath all beauty and the mortality that claims all power. "Your Highness," the chamberlain intoned from the doorway, his nostrils subtly flared, "the ambassador awaits." Margarita took a shallow breath, the only kind that offered any respite from her own condition. She straightened her spine, lifted the famous Habsburg jaw, gesture of defiance that was also a proclamation of her. Curson summoned a dignity that came not from her station, but from a deep personal reservoir of suffering. Let him in. While his sister prepared for her ordeal of diplomacy, the heir to this crumbling world was trapped in his own. In a sunlit room whose windows were barred to prevent a fall, King Charles II of Spain, at 12 years old, struggled with a basic reader. His tutor, a weary Jesuit named Father Philippe, pointed with a slender birch rod. "Again, Your Majesty. Dus. God." The boy's tongue, too large for his mouth, lolled against his teeth. His lower jaw, the infamous prognathism of his house, jutted so far forward that his lips could not meet, making his speech a wet, slurring mumble. "GGG." Saliva dripped onto the vellum page. "Deus," Father Philippe repeated, a note of despair creeping into his voice. Carlos's eyes, large and liquid and strangely vacant, wandered from the book. Through the iron-barred window, he could see the sons of courtiers playing in the courtyard below. They were running, shouting, their bodies strong and straight, their minds quick and unclouded. A world of movement and sound from which he was forever excluded. His body was a prison of ailments, legs weakened by rickets, a constitution so feeble a draught of cold air could confine him to bed for weeks, a mind that struggled to grasp the concepts other children his age mastered effortlessly. He was the most precious and fragile object in all of Spain, swaddled in cotton wool and ritual, protected from everything but the one thing that could truly harm him, his own blood. In the Council of State, the men who actually governed the empire grappled with the consequences of that blood. King Philip IV, now an old man whose face was a roadmap of sorrow, listened as his ministers debated the future. "The succession must be secured, Your Majesty," insisted the Duke of Medina de las Torres, his voice echoing in the cavernous chamber. "A marriage for Prince Carlos must be proposed, the House of Austria, or perhaps France." Philip IV closed his eyes. He knew what the physicians had told him in private. The boy was likely sterile. The Habsburg lip was the visible sign. The internal deformities, the ones they whispered about in Latin, were the true death sentence for his line. He had married his own niece, Mariana of Austria, to keep the bloodline pure. He had done his dynastic duty. And that duty had produced this final, tragic issue. The weight of generations of such decisions pressed down on him, a crown of lead and bone. A messenger, dust from the road still on his boots, burst into the chamber and fell to his knees, presenting a sealed dispatch. Philip broke the seal with trembling fingers. As he read, the last of the color drained from his face. "There has been an incident," he rasped, the paper fluttering in his hand. "The princess. She collapsed during the audience." The French ambassador saw everything. A collective groan filled the room. It was not concern for the girl's health that gripped them, but terror at the political fallout. Every weakness, publicly displayed, was a weapon in the hands of their enemies. Philip rose, his body aching. "This council is adjourned." He had to see his daughter. As he walked the long, cold corridors towards her apartments, he was not just a king going to his child. He was a ghost, walking alongside the ghosts of all his ancestors, Charles V, Philip II, Philip III, men who had forged this global empire, through war, faith, and marriage. He, Philip IV, would be remembered as the king who presided over its end. The irony was a taste of ash in his mouth. They had sought to create a bloodline of gods, and had instead created one of invalids. The year turned. The clock tower of the chimed. Marking a cool November day in 1679, the air was thick with the smell of incense and anticipation. In the cathedral of Santa Laurel de la Mudina, a spectacle of profound sadness was unfolding. The wedding of King Carlos II to Marie-Louise of the young French princess, just 17, was a vision of vibrant health and doomed courage. She had wept for a week upon first seeing her betrothed. Now she stood beside him, her smile a masterpiece of diplomatic training. Carlos, at 18, was a puppet king, dressed in magnificent robes that only emphasized his emaciated frame, his face a mask of white lead paint. He had to be supported under each arm by two tall grandees. His head lolled, his eyes struggled to focus. When the time came for him to place the ring on her finger, his hand trembled so violently the ring almost fell. A collective suppressed shudder went through the congregation of Spanish grandees and foreign ambassadors. In the front pew, the Queen Mother, Mariana of Austria, watched with a face of carved stone. She, the product of an uncle-niece marriage, the wife of her own uncle, saw not a tragedy, but a necessity. The blood must be preserved, even if the vessel was broken. The feast that followed was a study in cruel contrasts. The tables groaned with succulent roast boar, fragrant stews, and sweet pastries. Carlos, his malformed jaw making chewing agony, sipped at a thin broth. He was led away early, exhausted by the mere effort of standing. The real purpose of the wedding was yet to come. The consummation. That night, the held its breath. Carlos was prepared by his physicians, with tonics of crushed pearls and powdered stags, heart medicines of sympathetic magic, designed to impart strength and virility. Marie-Louise was counseled by her ladies on patience and duty. The following morning, there was no triumphant display of bloodied sheets. There was only a grim, silent acknowledgement of failure. The marriage could not be consummated. The years that followed were a slow, agonizing autopsy performed on a living king. Quacks and alchemists promised miracles. They prescribed potions of ground moonstone, baths in the milk of donkeys, elixirs containing everything from crushed vipers to dried human placenta. One particularly desperate treatment involved strapping the naked king to a table and slaughtering a goat above him, so that its hot, bloody entrails would shower his loins and transfer their vitality. Nothing worked. Modern genetic analysis would later reveal the horrifying truth. Carlos II was likely a compound heterozygote, also suffering from multiple genetic disorders due to his immense inbreeding. His coefficient of inbreeding was 0.254, higher than if his parents had been siblings. He was quite literally running out of functional genes. Marie-Louise died young, of suspected appendicitis, though many whispered it was from a broken heart. Within months, Carlos was married again to Mariana of Neuburg, a woman chosen explicitly for the famed fertility of her family. Her mother had borne 23 children. The result was the same. The king was biologically incapable of fathering an heir. The final act began in the autumn of 1700. Carlos II, 39 years old but looking 70, was dying. His body was a map of suffering. Edema swelled his limbs. Seizures racked his frame, and his mind drifted in and out of clarity. In his rare moments of lucidity, he was painfully aware of his failure. "I am sorry," he once whispered to his confessor. "So sorry for being so little use." The court, a nest of vipers, swirled with factions. The Queen Mother and her Austrian party, the French party. The supporters of a Bavarian prince, Saul, circled the dying king, trying to dictate the terms of his will and the future of Spain. On November 1st, 1700, All Saints' Day, Charles II of Spain breathed his last. The autopsy performed by his physicians was a gruesome confirmation of a lifetime of illness. His body contained not a single drop of blood, they reported. It was completely dry. His heart was the size of a grain of pepper. His lungs were corroded, his intestines were rotten and gangrenous. He had a single blackened testicle, and his head was full of water hydrocephalus. It was the body of an old man, ravaged by a lifetime of profound genetic illness. The will was read in the hushed throne room. The crown, and all its global dominions, was left to Philip, Duke of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France. The Habsburgs of Spain were no more. The War of the Spanish Succession exploded, engulfing Europe in fire and blood for over a decade. But that was a war of politics, of armies and alliances. The true war had been lost generations earlier, not on battlefields, but in the royal bedchambers of Europe. It was a silent, biological war, lost through a simple, catastrophic failure to understand a fundamental law of nature. The of Madrid, with all its ghosts, would burn to the ground in 1734. But the portrait of the young Infanta, Margarita Teresa, painted by in happier times, survives. She looks out at us, radiant and innocent, draped in a blue silk dress, surrounded by her maids of honor. It is a vision of perfect, contained grandeur. We look back, knowing what she could not, the scent that would follow her, the brother who would fail to continue their line, the future that would crumble to dust. We see not just a princess, but a perfect, tragic emblem of a dynasty that, in its quest for eternal purity, engineered its own exquisite extinction. The story of the Spanish Habsburgs is the ultimate vanity, a cautionary tale written not in ink, but in blood, a reminder that no wall of protocol, no mountain of gold, and no claim of divine right can ever triumph over the immutable laws of life itself.